So in this video, we're going to talk about Leonid Leonov's play Invasion. So this is a 1942 play, which is pretty significant because it's set during the Great Patriotic War, as it was called in the Soviet Union, and for all I know might still be called that in Russia. I'm not really sure. But in the West, we call it World War II. Right? So, if you know your history, you will know that 1942 was in the midst of World War II. The Nazi state had invaded the Soviet Union by this point. The Soviet Union had entered the war on the side of the Allies rather than being sort of a fellow traveler alongside the Axis, which they had been for the early part of the war, largely because the Soviet Union wanted to gobble up parts of Poland, where some of my ancestors were from, and Finland, right? So the Soviets wanted this territory. The Nazis in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact made a deal with the Soviet Union that basically they would divide Poland between them, and the Soviets went along with it. Then Hitler lied. What a shock. I'll give you time to clutch your pearls and gasp. Right? Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, which of course brought the Soviet Union onto the side of the Allies against Nazi Germany. Leonov's play is very much a socialist realist propaganda piece, as are most of the plays in classic Soviet plays, this collection that I'm reading this out of. But one thing that's unusual about it compared to the other plays in this collection is that it is a contemporary play. So the events that are being dramatized in Invasion are the kind of events that were currently occurring in the Soviet Union when the play premieres. It's also a romance in the generic sense, not in the sense of like, it's not a bodice ripper, right? It's not a romance novel or a rom-com or something like this. It's a romance in the sense that we have a character with a fatal flaw. In this case, let me get his full name. Okay, we don't... Fyodor Ivanovich? I can't remember if it's Ivanovich or Ivanov. I think it's Ivanovich. His father's name is Ivan, so... Or Ivan. So Fyodor, I think it's Ivanovich. Fyodor Ivanovich Talanov. Sorry. So this is sort of our protagonist, even though he's not really in the play all that much. So Fyodor has a fatal flaw, or a tragic flaw, as we might put it. So this is an interesting one, right? I think I've talked about this before, right? But in Aristotle's Poetics, for a long, long time, people understood, especially the Romantics, understood Aristotle's notion to be a fatal flaw, a character flaw, as opposed to a fatal error, which seems to be much more in line with what Aristotle himself actually meant. But anyway, this idea of the fatal flaw, the character flaw that undermines a person and their sort of ability to succeed, right? That's a very common dramatic trope. So Fyodor's fatal flaw is individualism. He is centrally concerned with himself, right? His own sufferings, his own experience. And this is something we've seen before, right? With Arbutsov's Tanya, for instance, we see this same thing where she grows and develops from being very individually focused to being collectively focused. And we get from fairly early on Fyodor's fatal character flaw, right? So he returns to his family's home. His father, Ivan Tikhonovich Talanov, is a doctor. He's a very successful doctor in this small town in the Soviet Union. And Fyodor has been in prison for some crime. Leonov never really tells us what it is. It doesn't really matter, right? It's not important for the story that Leonov wants to tell. But Fyodor has been in prison. He's now been released, and he comes back home. He's sick with tuberculosis, and he's not really welcome at home. And he's kind of rude to his family, and so they sort of go off to do other stuff to basically not be around him. And he's left with this woman who's not properly part of the family, but like she was his nurse as a kid, and she's sort of extended family, basically. And her name is Demidevnya. And she says, "Well, you've driven them all out. Now it's my turn. Well, just you try that lark with me, and don't glare at me like that. Save your strength. You're going to need it. Your father will be back from work soon. What are you baring your teeth for? We're not wolves. You sinned against people, and people have punished you for it. There's a war on. Little boys are laying down their lives. They're fighting to keep disaster at bay, and you keep looking into your own hard heart. Confess your sin to your nanny at least. Drive away the fear. Why did they pick you up and send you into the swamps way out in Siberia?" And Fyodor refuses to answer this question to anybody. He doesn't tell his crime to Demidevnya. He does not tell his crime to his father. He does not tell his crime to anybody, right? Again, it's not something that Leonov is interested in. It's not something he thinks it really matters. But this idea, you sinned against people and people have punished you for it. There's a war on. Little boys are laying down their lives. They're fighting to keep disaster at bay, and you keep looking into your own hard heart, right? This is Fyodor's fatal flaw. And again, this is something that's especially a fatal flaw within Soviet ideology, within communist ideology, in which service to others and self-sacrifice and things like this, the good of the collective, are supposed to come first, right? So this is Fyodor's problem. What his father basically tells him when Talanov arrives back home is that he has the prescription for Fyodor's illness. And Fyodor seems to think that this is his tuberculosis, right? The problems that he is having breathing. But Talanov is talking about a sort of deeper sickness, a sickness of character, his fatal flaw. So what Talanov says to his son is, "Look around, Fyodor. There's such tragedy coming over our land. The long-suffering Russian peasant woman stoops by the great forest fire, and the little children with her reek of the smoke from those flames, and it will never be blown out of their souls. How many of these half-slaughtered chickens have passed through my hands? Yesterday, for example, pain and wrath cloud in mind, pain and wrath, but your sickness is curable, Fyodor." Fyodor says, "Well, since the diagnosis has been made, sit down and write out a prescription." And Talanov says, "It's already written. It's justice to human beings." Fyodor is not keen on this answer. So he ends up sort of drifting in and out of his family's life. But the Nazis arrive. Basically, the Nazis take over this town. The former mayor or former merchant, something like this. I can't exactly remember what his former role was, but he has fallen from glory. A guy named Fyodor. He basically becomes the sort of local Nazi governor, or local governor on behalf of the Nazis within this town, and he takes over a part of Telenov's house to be his new home and office space, basically. While the Nazis are there, a lively resistance movement crops up, which is awesome. Medal for the anti-Nazi resistance, right? It's led by a guy named Kolesnikov. And they do a very clever thing, which is there seem to be a number of partisan operatives, but they sort of they're sort of trained to stab Nazis in the same way and leave a note that says, "Welcome," and is signed Andre. So the idea sort of develops that Andre is this sort of ghost, right? Who can attack people everywhere at once. And obviously the Nazi command is sort of, they realize what's going on. This is a partisan group using this psychological tactic, right? But it is nonetheless an effective and interesting psychological tactic. But Andre becomes this incredibly wanted man. And Andrei Kolesnikov, who had been the district supervisor, or chairman of the district Soviet's executive committee. So he had been chairman of the district Soviet executive committee. He had also been the fiance of Olga Leonov, who is Fyodor's sister. In one of the times that Fyodor sort of drifts into the house while Kolesnikov happens to be there, he's been shot in the arm. And basically, Fyodor is like, "Hey, I want to join up with the partisans." And Olga and Andre are sort of like, "We don't entirely trust you, so thanks, but no thanks." And so Fyodor sort of, he's trying in some sense to redeem himself, but he is unable to do so. And his family sort of assumes that he's drunk, even though he's got a fever because of his tuberculosis. So they have a very negative impression of him. So Fyodor goes out and he shoots the Nazi commandant of this town and his bodyguard, kills all of them, so medal for him again, but then he gets captured. And here is where it shifts to a romance. We have a sort of a tale of two cities gag going on here, because the first time that Kolesnikov enters the Leonov house, it says here, "Enter Kolesnikov in a fur jacket with a holster on his leather belt. He also has a high forehead, is tall, and has a slight resemblance to Fyodor." So, if you know your A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, you will remember that Sidney Carton and Charles Darnay are pretty much identical. And so Sidney Carton, the sort of dissolute, just dumpster fire of a human being, ends up sacrificing himself in place of Charles Darnay so that Darnay can remain with his wife, Lucy, whom both Darnay and Carton love, right? So Carton says, out of my love for Lucy, I am going to sacrifice my sort of wastrel life so that she can have the man that she wants. And the famous line is something like, "It is a far, far better thing I go to do now than I have ever done before." Something like that, right? And so what happens is Fyodor becomes Sidney Carton, sacrificing himself for the Charles Darnay, who in this iteration is Andrei Kolesnikov. And of course, Olga is sort of on the fringes of that, right? So presumably there is some level of Fyodor taking Andrei's place so that his sister's fiance does not get killed by the Nazis. But the bigger thing seems to be there's some element of sort of Fyodor seeking glory, seeking redemption by sacrificing himself. But I think the biggest thing for driving Fyodor is the sort of recognition that in the fight against the Nazis, Andrei remaining alive is more valuable than Fyodor remaining alive. So Fyodor takes the place of Andrei, right? So this white Russian who has sort of fled Russia during the revolution and has joined up with the Nazis, named Mosalsky. He is involved in the interrogation. So Mosalsky, they've captured Fyodor, they've brought him in for interrogation. Mosalsky says, well, who are you? Fyodor says, my name is Andrei Kolesnikov. Write it down, I'm not going to say it again. Mosalsky doubtfully says, that is your real surname? And Fyodor says, do you think I want to acquire the honor of swinging from the gallows on someone else's behalf? That is surely too high an honor for a pretender. And then Mosalsky, to the German officer, says, bitte schreiben Sie auf, meaning, please write it down. Then to Fyodor, he says, rank, class, occupation. Fyodor says, I'm Russian, I am defending my homeland. So, yeah, there is this sort of tale of two cities moment of sort of the switch of the two. And it's interesting because Kolesnikov is actually there in that house. And there seem to be some people who make that recognition. Obviously, the family knows, the Talanov family knows that this is Fyodor, who is now being interrogated and arrested as Kolesnikov, and Kolesnikov is hiding in their house as Fyodor. But Fyodor seems to also clock this, and he later tries to sort of bargain with Kolesnikov. Hey, the Germans are it looks like the Germans are suddenly going to lose. Just remember that I didn't turn you over to the Germans. You should probably prevent the successful Soviets from having me killed. And Kolesnikov is not taking that deal. But, so Fyodor sacrifices himself, right? He undergoes torture, and he is ultimately executed for being Andrei Kolesnikov, which allows Kolesnikov to survive. And at the end of the play, he actually sort of liberates the remaining partisans who have not yet been executed as they drive the Nazis out. So yeah, I mean, it's a combination of genres, right? It is socialist realism, it is propaganda, it is a romance,